the Beyond Sleep Training podcast, a podcast dedicated to sharing real tales of how people have managed sleep in their family outside of sleep training culture. Because sleep looks different with a baby in the house, and because every family is different, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to take. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is being recorded, the Kalkadoon people. I pay my respects to the elders of this nation and the many other nations our guests reside in from the past, present and emerging. We honour Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, water and seas, as well as their rich contributions to society, including the birthing and nurturing of children. We have a very special guest today. Her name is Pinky McKay, and Pinky has had a huge influence on my experience as a parent. And so as your host, Carly Grubb, I'm very excited that she could actually be on here today sharing her story about moving beyond sleep training. Pinky is one of Australia's most recognised and respected breastfeeding experts. She's an international board certified lactation consultant, which is an IBCLC, and the best-selling author of 4 titles, including Parenting by Heart and Sleeping Like a Baby, which I actually have with me here as 2 of my favourite books. Oh, and my other favourite book, Toddler Tactics, as well. Pinky specialises in gentle parenting styles that honour the mother's natural instincts to respond to their babies. And that is exactly what appealed to me. So welcome to the show, Pinky.
Thanks, Carly. And what a pleasure it is to be here. What a privilege.
It's very exciting for me because it kind of takes me back to all the very beginning of my own journey beyond sleep training, which I actually talked about in one of the earlier episodes. So once we all go to air and everything, Pinky, you'll be able to listen, and you get quite a few mentions in the early episodes as I talk about my journey. But it's not about me today. It's about you. And I'd love to hear more about your own family and how you came to the path of finding sleep without sleep training with your little babes.
Right. Well, I've got 5 kids. I've got nearly 18 years between the oldest and the youngest. So I had 4 kids in 10 years, and then I had a bonus baby, 8 years later, and which was quite beautiful and lovely for the older kids too, even though it was all, I'm up late with teenagers, up early with baby. He was my only one who woke at 5 a.m, for the day. And as the kids headed off to school, he would be ready for a nap, which meant, it was all just, sleep went out the window there quite a bit. But with the first baby, this was in the 70s. So I've had babies in the 70s. 2 babies in the 70s, 2 babies in the 80s, and my bonus baby in the 90s. So, I've seen lots of changes in advice. So when I had my first baby, it was sort of halfway between Truby King and Dr. Spock, I guess. So 4-hourly feeding, and I went home from hospital. My baby actually got a urinary tract infection in hospital and had to have lots of tests. And so he was in the baby NICU nursery. He was a big, nearly 9-pounder, but he was the fattest baby in the NICU because he was quite unwell. And so I was there for about 3 weeks before I got home. I didn't actually know much about postnatal depression, and that huge impacts it could have. But I lived upstairs and I said, if you send me home, I'll jump out the window. But I actually didn't. I just said it. I wasn't thinking that I would do that. I didn't even have suicidal thoughts. But it wasn't until later that I learned more about the total impact of how devastating that experience could be. So they let me stay in hospital, and I would go down to the nursery and, touch my baby when they weren't looking because he was in this big humidity crib. Anyway, I got home, and as I left hospital, I was told to feed him, and I was breastfeeding. I'd managed to get that milk supply back up again. It disappeared, but it came back up again. I just had this. There was a beautiful midwife who handed me a copy of the very old Woman, the Art of Breastfeeding. It was a little thin blue book, and I read it and I thought, oh, well, my milk's going to come back when that baby comes back, and it damn well did, because she just said to me, you can do demand feeding, which was really new. Like, they didn't call it Q feeding, it was demand feeding. So you were making this rod for your back with this baby because you were allowing him to demand feed. And I was told that you would feed him at 6, 10, 2 and 6, and then the 2 a.m. feed, at 6 weeks you were to cut that out by giving your baby a bottle of boiled water overnight, and then he would stop needing a night feed at 6 weeks. And I thought that was, just thought that was, yes, the dumbest advice, because I thought, why would I get up and go boil water in a bottle when I've got milk in my boobs? It didn't make any sense, you know. And one night I'd been getting, and my mother-in-law also told me that one of my sister-in-laws, who was super efficient, my husband's the youngest in the family, so I had five much older sister-in-laws. He's one of 7, 6 boys and 1 daughter. And his sister's a good friend of mine. She didn't have her baby till after my first one, but we sort of, you know, we didn't even know that we could collude until our kids were much older. But you know, so we kept quiet about what our babies were actually doing. And I just, you know, I didn't see the sense of making my baby wait for a feed, because what was I going to do for the next 2 hours when he needed a feed? So I just fed him, and I went to the child health nurse, and she said something about how many feeds a day is he having? I said, I don't know. And she said, has he dropped any feeds? I said, he's probably gone from 24 to 22. And she just laughed. She had just come back from working in New Guinea. So I was super lucky that I didn't get that pressure of, you know, that having to do the 4-hourly feed. But no, my mother-in-law used to tell me how the sister-in-law used to bath her babies before the 6 a.m. feed. And I'm not a morning person. There was no way I was bathing my baby before 6 a.m. I would feed him whatever time he woke, and I would just snuggle him into bed with me, and we'd go back to sleep for a few hours. Well, my husband actually let it drop amongst some of his family that, one night actually I got up and down. We'd found an antique cot, which probably was definitely not safety approved, in a second-hand shop as I was going past in the train. And when I was pregnant, I said to my husband, we've got to go back. I've seen this cot. And we found a man who would make the missing brass knob for it. It was beautiful. And I crocheted all these lovely blankets for it. My baby didn't give a stuff about this cot. And one night I got up and down to this baby and put him back in the cot, and then fed him, and then cuddled him and rocked him back to sleep. So, you know, and put him down, which of course was such a no-no. And I just was exhausted. And I handed him to my husband, who was just lying there with his bare chest in bed, and said, you have him, you know, you have him. And I just went back to sleep. And in the morning I woke up and foggy. I mean, probably only a few hours later, but, you know, I woke up, the daylight was streaming in, and this kid wasn't in his cot, and I'm throwing off the blankets looking for him. I turned around, sound asleep on my husband's chest. And I went, after that last feed at night, whatever time it is, I'm just going to pass him to my husband, and he can sleep on his
Daddy.
chest. Again, not safety recommended or anything like that. You know, we didn't know the difference, and nobody talked about safe bed sharing because it was a no-no. But I'd grown up in New Zealand. My own mother had taken me into her bed when I was a small baby, but then she says, but I had to because you wrecked me after birth, so I couldn't get up and down. So it was still, again, it was because of necessity rather than a problem. But nobody there really bothered. You know, it wasn't a bad thing that babies went into bed with you, because I had this first baby in Melbourne. I'd grown up in New Zealand, but had the first baby in Melbourne. And, and my husband let it slip to family members that, guess who slept on my chest last night? Oh, we were told we were going to kill this baby and what we were going to do. And I said to my husband, just don't say a word. So it was all under wraps that this child, you know, did it. And when he was about 8 months old, we went back to New Zealand. 9 months old, we went back to New Zealand. My husband's an Australian, but we moved over there. And my mother warned me at about, you know, getting close to a year that if I didn't wean this child, I was going to lose my husband, because I had an uncle who was quite a womanizer. All the women he ever brought to our place didn't even have children. So it wasn't about that, but his wife, my auntie, was breastfeeding my cousin till, you know, she was walking, talking child, about 4 or so, which was very unusual in those days. And so, this is the reason he left, because his wife was breastfeeding this toddler and he didn't get a look in. Apparently, this was just the gossip around the net, that this is what happened. So he was never told he was a prick of a man who, shouldn't have been doing these things. So
no, he couldn't have any responsibility, as the adult partner. No, it was definitely the baby and the way she was behaving.
All the magazines and all of the media in those days, I mean, there was no television, there was no, or there might have been a bit of television there was television by the 70s, but, there were magazines. There was no sort of, apart from Dr. Spock, perhaps, there weren't really many books about babies, but all of the media was about you had to look after your husband. You, as a woman, that was your job. So keep
priorities,
him from straying,
because you're lucky just to have one,
Oh, absolutely. And he's got no responsibility whatsoever. No. I mean, he's the breadwinner. You have to look after him, which actually, it was so different culturally that, this was the man's responsibility was to make the money and the woman's responsibility was to nurture him so that he could do that, which probably makes a bit of sense in some ways, but you don't have to nurture him that much that he's a dependent person with no brain and no...
He's not a man baby, surely.
And no impulse control, surely. But anyway, my mum had heard about La Leche League and I could learn how to wean my baby if I went to La Leche League. And I thought, well, okay, but I still didn't head along. But I visited, we'd only stayed with my parents for a little while and then we moved into a house, and a lady next door to an aunt and uncle in that town was a Leche League group leader, and she invited me to a meeting. And I went along. My child was about 15 months by then, and I had no clue how I was going to wean this child, what a 15-month-old is like. And it was, and I was quite stressed about this. How was I going to actually wean this child who by then was sleeping in our bed and breastfeeding ad lib, and and boob was just what he did. It was just, we'd got into this groove. I never ever implemented this stupid whatever it was, bottle of water at night or anything. But I was just confused as to how it was ever going to stop, because I had no modelling. I had nobody in the family, didn't know anybody who was, after my first child was 3 months old in Melbourne, I didn't know anyone else who was breastfeeding. We lived near the Children's Hospital in Melbourne, and one woman in my mother's group was a nurse at the Children's Hospital, and another mother was a dentist's wife, and they both stopped breastfeeding at 3 months because that was considered a good start. So again, get your body back, and that was it. So I was really the weirdo that was, I'd made this rod for my
trailblazer, more like.
Yeah, well, I went to the GP. I had a lump in my breast when he was, 7 or 8 months old, and I went to the GP, and he pressed my breast and got squirted in the eye. I didn't know I had a blocked duct.
That's awesome.
And he said to me, "Oh, you're breastfeeding," and I went, "Yeah."
Yes, I am.
He was absolutely stunned. He says, "Oh, that's a surprise," he said, but it's very good.
Oh, good. See, you got another supportive person. How lucky were you in all of these little bits, even when it was a surprise?
Until I was at my grandmother's house. This was, when I was told to wean. I actually got mastitis, went to the GP and thought I was just going to get antibiotics. He sat behind his desk, didn't even look at my breast, and wrote a script and said, "Your milk will dry up very quickly." And I said, "What do you mean? Have you given me antibiotics?" "Oh, yes, but these are the tablets to dry up your milk." And I went back to my grandmother's house, and my cousin was there, and she was a pharmacist, and she's saying, "Oh, well, you can't breastfeed on these." I said, "Well, who says I'm taking them?" And my gorgeous grandfather, who's a farmer, sitting in the armchair in the corner as we're sitting at the table having these cups of tea, said, "You take a cow off the calf, it'll bellow for weeks." And I went, "Thanks, Papa." So you see, every time I just had one more cheerleader.
That's so funny.
I went off and put my, breastfed my baby to bed thinking, well, will this be his last breastfeed? And then my brain relaxed and I thought, nah, I'm going to chuck those pills down the toilet. And I told my nana, Nana I had, and she went down to the local baby shop and asked Eileen at the local baby shop round the corner from her if she knew anybody that knew the answer to this thing. And she rang Eileen rang her daughter, who got me the number of a La Leche League person, who told me, no, I was right, I could keep breastfeeding. So that was, and that's then we moved. So I was just really lucky that when I hit a roadblock, my gut was saying, this doesn't feel right, that I actually ended up connecting with the right people. And when I went to the La Leche League meeting, I was just gobsmacked. And I was so relieved because there were people there it was an evening meeting. There were little kids running around, breastfeeding, like 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds still breastfeeding. And I went, oh my God, I don't have to wean my child. It was just so awesome. So, and then I found they had a library, and there was, Bill Sears books in the library, and there was Touching by Ashley Montague, and, beautiful things that just felt so right to me. So I always say, just don't be afraid to step up and say what you're doing, because somewhere out there might be a lonely mother who, just is confused because her gut or her heart's telling her one thing and everyone else is telling her something different.
Especially those people like me who really didn't want to break rules. I thought I had to follow rules. So finding someone like you who is not afraid to actually step outside those rules is it's hugely empowering for others around you as well. It's really important.
I think so, yeah. But I've never been one to follow rules. I was the girl kicked out of the school class umpteen times.
I love that about you. Thank you, Pinky. We all need a little channel more of that.
If you have a wild child who doesn't listen to anyone, actually, even my family laugh because, again, back in the 70s, the wedding vows were love, honour and obey. And I sat there, my husband's brother was a minister, and this was one of his friends. And I said, no, I'm not saying that. And I said, I'm not starting with a lie. I've never obeyed anyone in my life. And when he told my mum that, because she was in New Zealand and come to my wedding, she said, well, she's never obeyed anyone that I know of.
I'm pretty sure your husband probably knew what he was getting in for anyway. So he probably didn't really have
me to obey, but
no, that's what I mean. Like, I don't think he would have, knowing you, he would not have been expecting you to go along with that one.
I don't think he's ever expected me to obey him, but it was really funny that I'd never really thought about vows until they said I had to say this, and I went, but I can't say it and mean it.
It's not a vow.
I think I'd always, so breaking the rules wasn't one of my problems.
And I love that, because especially it's probably even more important for you back then. Like you said, you had literally no role models. So if you weren't able to actually, question the advice around you and follow your baby, it would have been nearly impossible, which is probably why you didn't have any role models around you, because most people wouldn't necessarily have had that in their character, that they would question things that much to be able to listen to themselves.
No, because in those days, you'd never question a health professional. You'd never question a doctor. Your child health nurse would be telling you, because New Zealand, they're always saying, the Plunket nurse says, and back then.
It's similar. Well, it's similar even now, really, isn't it? Like, especially for a first-time parent, you really do feel quite often like you need to turn to people who do this for a living, like that this is their whole jam. Knowing about babies.
Right. And they're experienced and they've got qualifications, and who are you to put your baby at risk by not doing what they tell you?
Yes, and you assume it's evidence-based because they're saying it, and you trust that they wouldn't say something that wasn't best practice, which we all now know is not necessarily the case. So tell me, what was your background before you had your babies? Were you working in health before babies?
I'd been a nurse in New Zealand, but even then there were very low levels of breastfeeding. I, just did a stint at the maternity ward, because part of the nursing training was a bit of maternity, and I can't remember whether it was a month or whatever it was that we did that, and I really only saw very few people who were breastfeeding from birth. Then it was at the really lowest rate of breastfeeding. And I remember seeing, because I was young, I was only 21 when I had my first child, but I remember seeing a woman who, you'd go around every day and feel the woman's fundus, to see how their uterus was contracting and check their pads and bleeding. And the very few women who were breastfeeding involuted really quickly. And they, it just, to me, it just seemed like, why wouldn't you do that? Because that's obviously the best thing for your body. And also, I barely had a chest. I had decided that I would breastfeed right, because my baby was born in April, so start of winter. And I thought, well, I'm going to breastfeed right through summer, because then I'll be able to wear a bikini. That was not my prime reason. That was one of my reasons, but also the babies that I had seen that were breastfed, they were healthy babies and they had a beautiful glow about them. And I'd grown up in the country and knew that the bus-fed calves had the most beautiful coats. Those sort of things had influenced me that, I needed to breastfeed so my baby would be healthy. So it didn't occur to me not to breastfeed. But when I saw these women who, those uteruses would go down within days, because people stayed in hospital for, a week to 10 days then. That was what they did after having a baby. They'd have 10 days in hospital. And the women who were not breastfeeding, who dried up straight up, they would be in pain and agony. They would have binders on, tight binders, like a draw sheet wrapped around it, and we'd have to safety pin them around their breasts. It was horrible. And I just thought, and their uterus was still barely contracting because they weren't doing any breastfeeding.
Wow.
So they would decide not to breastfeed from birth. So I thought, well, why would you do that and put yourself through so much agony? I didn't realise breastfeeding could also be painful.
Yeah.
Because, I had really sore nipples. I'm looking in hindsight, I would have had thrush on my nipples, but, because my baby was given antibiotics, but I didn't, it wasn't even a recognised thing then. So I was given this stuff to paint on my nipples, which was, I think it was called Tink Ben's Co. So it was sort of like a mixture of betadine and some kind of oil, castor oil or something like that. It was really not very nice stuff. And your nipples were shiny like bright orange headlights, like when you put betadine on. Why would I?
Did you have to then clean that off before you fed?
Oh, you couldn't have. You'd have had to scrub it.
Oh, wow. And Babe didn't mind? Just imagining the colour of the nappies.
No. It was just, they just sucked it off. And it didn't come off. But you're permanently had in yellow nipples that were soaked into your skin. Yeah, nobody said take it off. But talking about scrubbing brushes, when I was pregnant, the advice was to toughen your nipples up by using a nail brush, scrubbing them with a nail brush before you have your baby. And my obstetrician told me that, and I said to him, oh, I can think of something you could scrub with your nail brush.
Go your hardest.
Yeah. And I think that was just being, a bit of a cheeky young girl. At that stage I was nursing in an X-ray department, but, I just didn't have a lot to do with babies and breastfeeding really until I had my own.
Yet still you had quite a sure view that is what you wanted to do with your own baby. So it's like there was enough background there for you.
And I know that my mother breastfed me for 9 months, and I've got a younger sister, and I remember when Mum weaned her at about, I don't know, it's been about 3 months. Mum had PND and she'd had psychosis after I was born, but in New Zealand they'd put the mothers and babies into hospital together, and breastfeeding was really encouraged at that generation. It was later that the formula feeding came in. And so I remember her weaning my baby sister onto this yellow tin of formula. I think it was Glaxo, and it was the Sunshine Glaxo that was the yellow one, and then you went on to the blue one. And I remember her coming out in this horrible rash, and she had terrible asthma as a child. And I thought, so that was enough for me to just go, look, breastfeeding's obviously going to give you a healthy baby.
Yeah, awesome.
Because they always talked about me. I was the naughty child who wouldn't wean, I wouldn't suck rubber. I think I must have been born a bad baby.
You just knew what you wanted, and you were only going to accept the best. That's what was going on there by the sound of it.
About 9 months, 9 or 10 months, my mum, because my young uncle, teenage uncle, had taught me to say titty. So That was
Helpful
terribly
uncle.
embarrassing. So I had to be weaned. So mum took drying up pills and yeah, that was it.
Well,
But
you got 9 months, which sounds like
I
a
got
lot
my
longer than
months,
a lot
which
of
was,
babies did, that's for sure.
I know, it
Now,
was totally extraordinary. Yeah, so with my second baby, I was in this lovely cocoon of La Leche leg women. My oldest child weaned while I was pregnant with him. Um, yeah, and I just, it was just lovely to have that beautiful support and community around. I mean, very lucky when you think about it today that community in my neighborhood was lovely because other women, they'd come to my home to the La Leche League meetings because by then I was, a group leader. And my best friend, who was another, I'd met her through La Leche League, and we would actually swap children because we had different age group children, and she might take the big ones and I'd take the little ones or something, just or vice versa. And one day I was in the fruit shop and I had her child, I was a 2-year-old, sitting in my trolley, and my child, who was a similar age, he was just a little bit older, another year older, but he was, there. And some woman, I didn't even know. So again, I got notorious for breastfeeding these older babies, but some woman in the fruit shop that I only knew from sight really came up to me and said, "Are you still breastfeeding him?" And I said, "Oh no, my friend breastfeeds this one." And
face poof.
face pop, what?
Oh, I love it.
So,
Yeah, well,
it
just
was just, yeah. And then when I came back to Melbourne with a 6-month-old baby, our third child was 6 months. So we're there for about 5 years. Larissa was 6 months old. And again, I really hit the brick walls. I went to a nursing mothers conference. I was asked because I'd been working between those two children. Because I had a 4.5-year gap, I had worked weekends in the maternity ward in Hamilton in New Zealand at Waikato Women's. And so I knew what we were using, the Whittlestone milkers on the ward, and they were big, like a cupboard that you pushed around and had these pumps, but it was a physiological breast pump that could do both sides at once, because up till then you had a glass thing with a bulb at the end and you squeezed this bulb and you slurped your nipple up, but there was no sizing. It really hurt. Was horrible. That's what cracked my nipples with my first baby when he was in NICU. But this was a beautiful pump with spongy stuff on the cups, and it pulsated as it went on your breast. It pulsated like a real, like the sucking, as close to the sucking action. So it was devised by a physiologist called Walter Whittlestone, who worked, because we were in Hamilton, and there was Ruakura, which was a dairy research centre. So they'd do research for dairy, which brought in lots of money, but he actually worked there and started doing work for mothers, which was awesome. And this pump was going to be demonstrated at a nursing mothers conference in Sydney. So they flew me and my baby up there to demonstrate this pump, which was actually held up in customs. But I was asked to put my 6-month-old baby in the creche, not sit with her in the seminar. So I sat in the creche with my baby because I thought, I'm not leaving my baby with a pack of strangers. She's 6 months old. She doesn't even know where she is.
teeny tiny bubba.
So then there were people who'd gone to that conference and left young babies at home.
But this is a nursing mothers conference, right?
Things have really changed since
Yes.
then. Yes. And so I came back to Melbourne, not having demonstrated that pump, not having sat in the conference, because I was sat, in those days, it was a beautiful hotel with lovely posters of mothers and babies all around the wall, but the babies were in the creche. And for me, that was just, I can't. So that's why with all my seminars and everything, I say, bring your babies, because that feeling is so horrible that you're not welcome because you have a baby.
And then the fact that you're meant to be able to concentrate while your baby's off with somebody else and you're not even sure if they're settled, as if you're going to be taking in the information.
Yeah. But I guess the reverse was thought then, that if you have your baby with you, you won't be able to take in the information. And your baby might disturb other people. But, if you're a breastfed baby, you just flop out, if in doubt, flop it out, and they just suck and they're quiet.
It's a fascinating perspective that so much, it's like all work stops when there's a baby around. It's like, no, actually there's plenty of work that is achieved with babies around and at the breast and various other things. But it's still a common misconception that the only valuable work can be done without kids around. So, yeah,
Yes.
I can see
Yeah.
how that would have been the case back then.
So I
But
faced another battle with this third baby. I even went to a nursing mothers meeting in the evening and was told that this is our night out without our babies. So I never went back. I actually never went back
oh,
until, and yet the Breastfeeding Association is such a magnificent organisation, but there was their vice president, who I met in Sydney at this conference. Turned out she lived not far from me, and we started a HLE group in Melbourne, and thinking, oh, well, look, maybe we'll just find some other women that are, a bit more relaxed about this and a bit more, connected, because La Leche League had this background of 10 concepts. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Like things like, what is it? There was some about nutrition. So you'd never find chocolate biscuits at a La Leche League meeting. There'd never be Tim Tams. There'd always be, there might be wholemeal muffins or something like that. So nutrition is a wide variety of foods in its natural state as possible. There were a few other things about weaning, and there was one about separation in mothers and babies too. Like those sort of things informed. And as a group leader, you had to
honour those.
honour those. Yeah. I mean, there weren't rules, but they were
No.
just concepts that this was the best for that relationship between mother and baby. So, there were beautiful books about co-sleeping. What was one called? The Family Bed, which came out with a bit controversial, but, there were lovely, lovely, lovely information that reinforced that nurturing. And then to find that once again I was back in the space where I went to a talk at the local kindergarten. I took my 6-month-old baby, and the man from the university, the lecturer, was talking about leaving babies to cry. It was sleep training, but straight up leave them to cry. And someone put their hand up and said, how long do you leave them to cry for? He said, till they stop. So this was what I'd come back to. So again, the pressure was there with that third baby, but just that isolation, So we started this La Leche League group, and beautiful mums came from down the hills and around about, and there were lots of expats. There was a mum from Turkey who'd been to La Leche League there. There were 2 mums from South Africa. There were some American mums, and they were either here because their husbands were working here, or they'd moved to Australia. And another mum from Czechoslovakia. There were mums from all over who we got together, and we're still in touch. It's really beautiful.
We will be able to fill
Facebook
that gap for people. Yeah.
It
It's
did,
that,
yeah.
it really
Yeah.
is that it's such a vulnerable time in your life, but you're so much stronger when you have people around you who can support you through it. And
And even if it's not your
something.
first baby, if you have, I think support is the biggest thing for any mother. So, that would be my tip. Reach out. And if you can't reach out, I don't care how you do it, but you can do it on the internet now. So, Beyond Sleep Training is, no wonder it's boomed, because mothers are isolated when they feel that they're not fitting in with whatever the culture says.
That's right. And it has to, there's this twang that comes from inside, even when you try to deny it sometimes, it often's still there in the background. And I think that's something, it can take time, but it can, if you can find people in real life, I know for me, that was a massive, massive thing with my second and third baby. I had friends around me with my first baby, but I was so in on myself. I kind of needed to build myself up, find my way of mothering that was quite different to those around me. But I found with my second and third, it's almost like I started to attract more like-minded people as I got more confident in myself. I wasn't ashamed to say how I was mothering my babies
last night. Yeah.
Yeah. And it definitely,
my bed. Yeah.
yeah. And all of a sudden you realize you're actually not so alone once you start feeling confident enough to say it out loud, because it's a really common experience, funnily enough, that most of us have babies who need a lot from us. And there's certainly a lot more of us who were co-sleeping very secretly, who once one person in the group, whispers it out, you quickly find that there's many other people who've also got babies in the bed with them also.
Yes, and I found working with mothers, one time, a few years ago, I saw 3 mothers within the same suburb within a week of each other. And I'd say, babies the same age, and I'd say to them, have you talked about this in your mother's group? Oh no, everyone's so together. And I said, look for the mother who's not speaking out, because she might be the mother who, again, is not speaking out because she feels she can't. And I think that's another thing. You know, if you're in your mother's group and everybody else is saying, oh, yes, I've got my baby on this magic routine, blah, 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 you know, then the mother who's not owning up to that quite possibly is the mother who's taking her baby into her bed and feeling shameful that she's rocking her baby to sleep. It's not self-settling, whatever this baby is doing, that she just feels so alone. She can't speak up because she does think that everyone else is so together.
Yeah, and she could be that mum too who then also goes home and has a good cry because she thinks she's the only one who has a baby not sleeping. So
that's right.
That was definitely me. I just it was hard because I think it's sort of, you can be the person who speaks up, and it's always great to then have others kind of wrap you up with some solidarity, but it takes a bit of courage.
Yeah.
You do, and it's very vulnerable. I know that was hard for me. It was hard, especially coming from a perfectionist background, to actually go, hang on a sec, guys, like, I'm not okay over here. Like,
because you're going to be, you know, you really have to be brave, because if you get slapped down on top of that, you know, if you say, oh, this is really hard, and they go, oh, we all love it.
Mm-hmm.
And I had mothers that's happened to too. And you just go, that's so cruel.
I think, though, that sometimes is the surface layer, because I know for me that, you know, talking about things, it's not usually in that moment that you get people coming and fessing up along with you. It's usually the more quiet message that you'll get later and go, hey, I'm so glad you said that. Me too, or whatever. So it's often like, you know, in that moment, you might not get that feeling that you've had any impact whatsoever, or maybe you feel completely shattered because you just got shut down, but it can come in from the sides as well. So yeah, I think that's really important, and thank you for that tip. Now I'm going to have to finish up this episode. Are you happy to stick around for another episode with us so we can hear more about I would love to hear more if that's okay. All right. So thank you for joining us today, everybody. And this episode will be followed up with further information from Pinky McKay. But thank you for coming along today. I really hope you enjoyed the podcast today. The information we discussed was just that, information only. It is not specific advice. If you take any action following something you've heard from our show today, it is important to make sure you get professional advice about your unique situation before you proceed, whether that advice be legal, financial, accounting, medical, or any other advice. Please reach out to me if you do have any questions, or if there's a topic you'd really like us to be covering. And if you know somebody who'd really benefit from listening to our podcast, please be sure to pass our name along. Also, check out our free peer support group, the Beyond Sleep Training Project, and our wonderful website, www.littlesparklers.org. If you'd like even more from the show, you can join us as a patron on Patreon, and you can find a link for that in our show notes. If listening's not really your jam, we also make sure we put full episode transcripts on our Little Sparklers website for you to also enjoy, and fully captioned YouTube videos as well on our Little Sparklers channel. So thanks again for listening today. We really enjoy bringing this